The Red Marriage of Whit Barrow by Elowen Greaves, read by Wilbur Friesman-Durst. It was in the autumn of 1886 that I paid my visit to Whit Barrow at the invitation of my old acquaintance, Edward Lawton. We had corresponded fitfully for years, mostly on matters of antiquarian trifles, and it was only upon hearing of his recent acquisition of the old vicarage that I resolved to accept his oft-repeated offer of hospitality. The journey down was pleasant enough. The train bore me as far as Shrewsbury, from which a hired trap carried me the remaining distance across a gentle, undulating countryside, thick with hedgerows, low stone walls, and the scattered red and gold of the late turning leaves. I arrived just as the day surrendered itself to that pale amber light which seems to exist solely for October afternoons. The village itself was small, little more than a winding lane lined with slate-roofed cottages, a modest inn, and, rising at its far end, the church of St. Hilary's. Squat, sturdy and crowned with a square tower, its lichen-streaked stones already cooling in the lengthening shadows. Edward was waiting for me at the gate to the vicarage, a tall man whose narrow frame seemed always half folded into itself. His handshake, though firm, betrayed the faint tremor I recalled from our student days. "My dear fellow," he said, ushering me through the gate with a smile that was, I thought, tinged faintly with relief, "you've arrived in excellent time. We've another hour of light before the real chill settles in." The house, set back modestly from the churchyard, was precisely the sort of place that encouraged long evenings of reading, late walks beneath indifferent stars, and, if one were so inclined, a gentle indulgence in speculative thought. Edward had already made it thoroughly his own, the hall crowded with bookcases and cabinets, a small writing desk in every available corner, and the ever-present thin thread of pipe smoke coiling beneath the ceiling beams. We dined simply but well, roast game, a decanter of claret, and afterward a small glass of Edward's rather excellent plum cordial. Our conversation, as was our habit, ambled across a dozen topics: recent finds in parish libraries, a curious set of Flemish woodcuts he had lately acquired, and the minor scandals of mutual acquaintances now holding posts in various sleepy colleges. It was only quite late, well after the fire had settled into a steady glow, that Edward made his first, brief reference to the church. "You must let me take you over tomorrow," he said lightly, swirling the last of the cordial in his glass. "St. Hilary's is older than it looks. Parts of the chancel go back well before the Normans, though naturally there have been additions." There was, I thought, a faint evasiveness in his tone, as though he approached the topic by habit and not desire. But I let it pass. After all, one does not journey into the country to press one's host on what may amount to nothing more than parochial oddities. The clock chimed softly in the corner. Outside, the wind had risen faintly, stirring the old yew beyond the churchyard wall. We retired not long after, but I confess, as I settled beneath the unfamiliar covers, that my mind lingered on the way Edward's eyes had briefly shifted when first he spoke of the church, and whether his invitation to visit it tomorrow carried a note of obligation more than enthusiasm. The next morning greeted us with a grey, steady mist that blurred the village into soft contours. The air was neither cold nor warm, but held that peculiar stillness common to old places that have long made peace with neglect. After a modest breakfast, we set out. Edward led the way through the narrow garden gate and along the short path that wound towards St. Hilary's. The church stood solid and unimposing, its weathered stones streaked with a dark tracery of centuries of rain, its narrow windows still showing faint coloured glass beneath protective shutters. As we approached, the details became more curious. I noted small irregularities in the stonework, patches where older blocks jutted slightly beneath later courses, fragments of decorative carving, long worn into indistinct whorls. The bell tower was low and square, with only 2 visible lancet openings, their iron grills deeply set. "It was built in stages, you see," Edward explained, drawing his coat a little tighter. "Bits of late Saxon work, I believe. There's a half-buried arch along the northern side that no one's ever quite explained. The village makes little out of it." We passed through a small lich gate and into the churchyard proper. The gravestones stood thickly clustered, leaning against one another like conspirators. Some bore dates from the last few decades, others had long surrendered their inscriptions to the lichen and frost. As we walked, Edward's manner grew quieter, his usual flow of commentary pausing between longer stretches of silence. We reached the porch, where the heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. Edward pushed it open with some effort, and we stepped into the dim cool of the nave. The air was heavy with that mixture of damp stone and old wood, particular to country churches left largely to themselves. The pews were narrow, their ends carved with plain, rounded finials, and the simple altar stood beneath a faded tapestry, whose original pattern had long since retreated into vague shadow. What caught my eye almost immediately, however, was the register. It rested not in a vestry or clerk's office, but rather in a small wooden case mounted just inside the chancel screen, a curious place for so important a record. Its presence there seemed oddly ceremonial, as though intended for public notice, yet likely viewed by none. Edward followed my gaze, but offered no immediate comment. "The register has been kept here for as long as anyone remembers," he said finally. "It's quite complete. Surprisingly so. Some of the entries go back further than the church's present fittings." His tone was carefully neutral. I detected the faintest shift in his posture, as though the very topic weighed upon him. "May I?" I asked. He nodded once. "Of course." I crossed to the case, and after some mild resistance from the old latch, lifted the cover. The register was older than I expected, a thick volume bound in cracked leather, its vellum leaves discolored at the edges, but still perfectly legible. The script varied with the hand of each succeeding vicar. Yet the order of the entries remained precise. Births, marriages, deaths, the small scaffolding of village existence. And then, as I turned a later page, my eye caught a marriage entry that seemed, at first glance, unremarkable, until I read the dates, and my breath slowed. The entry was recorded with the same steady hand as those before and after it, in neat black ink that had faded only slightly over the years. The names were plainly written: Simon Elbright, bachelor of this parish, and Eliza Dampier, spinster of the same. The difficulty lay not in their names, but in the dates that accompanied them. Simon Elbright, born 1623. Eliza Dampier, born 1794. The marriage itself recorded solemnly as having taken place on the 14th of May, 1817. I read the entry twice, then a third time, tracing the flowing script with my eye as though repetition might smooth the contradiction. But there it remained, an impossible pairing documented with the same calm precision as every other union on the page. I glanced toward Edward, who stood a few paces behind me, arms folded loosely, his gaze lowered to the flagstones. "You've seen this?" I said quietly. He nodded. "Yes." "And you've made no inquiry?" A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, more weary than amused. "Inquiries have a way of leading to stories, and stories here are best left uncollected." His tone was not dismissive but cautious, as one might speak of an unstable beam one has grown accustomed to ignoring. I looked back at the register. "There's no explanation, no family legend." Edward inhaled softly. "There are whispers, that's all. A story about the red marriage of Whit Barrow, though most don't call it that aloud. I've found no official record beyond this page and the stones outside. The graves, he nodded again. They're side by side. Would you like to see? I closed the register carefully and replaced the lid of the case. My pulse had quickened in that peculiar way it sometimes does, not from fear exactly, but from that unsettling thrill one feels when reality allows the impossible to sit openly in its ledger. We stepped back out into the churchyard. The mist had lifted slightly, but still clung in low ribbons between the leaning stones. Edward led the way along a narrow path toward the north wall, where the older markers gathered like silent witnesses. At last he stopped before two weathered slabs, set close together beneath the heavy limb of a yew that bent protectively over them. The first stone, though worn, was still legible. Simon Elbright died 1691, aged 68. The second bore clearer carving, the letters deeper and more regular. Eliza Dampier died 1827, aged 33. The stones stood side by side as though the impossible marriage recorded in the register had carried its impossibility even into death. Edward said nothing, neither did I for the moment. The air was very still. Only the faintest creak of the yew disturbed the quiet, as though it too were listening. At length I spoke, my voice low, as though the stones themselves might overhear. So then, I said, it was not a simple clerical error. The entry was written with too careful a hand, nor can we call it a crude hoax, for who would gain from such an absurd fabrication? Whatever the origin, the dates were recorded deliberately. Edward gave a slow nod. Precisely so. It is not the kind of inconsistency that arises from carelessness. Whoever set it down, whether vicar or clerk, wrote what he believed or what he was made to believe belonged in that register. I knelt to study the stones more closely. The difference in their age was unmistakable. Simon Elbright had been laid to rest nearly a century before Eliza Dampier had even been born, and yet here they stood side by side as though time had folded to allow their union. "There are no descendants?" I asked. "None traced," Edward replied softly, "nor are either of the families particularly remembered here. Elbright's name appears scarcely at all elsewhere, and the Dampiers were a minor branch. Tenant farmers, I believe. The line died out before mid-century." I straightened slowly. "And what of this term you used? The red marriage?" He hesitated. "That part is less tidy." We resumed our walk, slowly circling the churchyard's older stones, the mist still curling in thin veils about us. Edward spoke as we moved, his voice careful, as though recounting something not entirely his own. "There's an older tradition here, one seldom voiced now except by the few who still linger from the oldest families. It concerns marriages improperly sanctified, unions not recognized by the church, nor by law, nor by time itself." He paused, glancing at me. "The term red is said to mark such unions, not for blood, though some suggest darker origins, but for their offense against the proper order. A stain, you see, rather than a wound." I let this settle a moment. "And does the tale end there?" I asked. Edward's brow furrowed faintly. "There are accounts. A few villagers claim to have seen them once or twice, a man and a woman, neither entirely clear, walking together here or near the church porch, but never by day." We stood for a time in the quiet. The mist thickened as the sun weakened behind the clouds, and it was, I reflected, a place where stories might survive longer than their tellers, and where time itself might not always remain properly fixed. I let his words hang for a moment longer before speaking again. The faint dampness in the air seemed to press gently against the skin, as though the churchyard itself wished to listen. "Red marriage," I repeated softly. I'm not sure I entirely understand the meaning of it. It is not a term I've encountered in any of the old ecclesiastical statutes or canon laws." Edward gave a small, tight smile, the kind that carries both discomfort and familiarity with the uncomfortable. "No, I shouldn't think you would," he said, glancing down toward one of the older stones whose face had long surrendered to the creeping lichen. "It isn't a legal term at all. Not in any official sense. It's more of a village phrase, a sort of half-remembered superstition, I suppose." He paused then, considering, as though sorting out which threads of the old tale might safely be drawn forward. "I once heard it described," he continued after a moment, "by an old chap, Mr. Stenton, that was his name. He was something of an amateur historian, though prone to wandering into local fancy when the facts grew thin. I remember he said it over a luncheon at the Shropshire Society years ago while recounting curious anomalies in parish records." Edward glanced sideways at me as we walked, his breath faintly visible now as the temperature dipped. "Stenton claimed the term red marriage was sometimes applied to those rare and peculiar unions which the Church, for one reason or another, could not, or would not, legitimize. But not in the way of clandestine marriages or improper bans, rather marriages which stood outside of time." "Outside of time?" I repeated, frowning slightly. "Precisely, as though two lives belonging to different centuries, or different circumstances entirely, had found themselves momentarily drawn together, and the ritual of marriage somehow fixed the connection. A joining not permitted, yet not wholly prevented." The path curved gently as we spoke, bringing us beneath the heavy branches of another great yew whose needles fell in slow, silent descent around us. "These weren't ordinary forbidden matches, runaway elopements or the like," Edward went on. "They were said to occur rarely, and only at places where the boundary between things grows thin. Churches, naturally, certain graveyards, standing stones, even. And when such a marriage occurred, it left a mark. A red mark, symbolically speaking. A stain upon the record, upon the ground, even upon the memory of the village itself." We paused, as a soft wind stirred the mist into shifting veils, momentarily obscuring the far rows of gravestones. "It was never quite clear to me whether Stenton believed any of it," Edward added after a moment, his voice quieter now. "But he recited the tale with a conviction that suggested others had, or still did." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into the cool, damp air. "And here in Whit Barrow we have one such mark," I said, glancing back toward the stones. "Two lives, centuries apart, recorded together. The record holds them married, and so too does the earth, it seems." Edward nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said softly. "Here, it would seem, we do." The mist thickened then, folding around us with a peculiar intimacy, as though the churchyard had closed its curtain, drawing the two of us inward into its ancient hush. We stood there for some time, neither of us speaking, while the mist crept and curled between the stones like pale fingers threading a loom. The village beyond was muted now, its cottages reduced to vague shapes behind the hedgerows. Even the yew branches above us seemed to hang lower, as though weighted by the hush that had settled over Whit Barrow. At last Edward stirred and turned us gently back toward the vicarage. "Best we not linger much longer," he said in a voice pitched slightly lower, as though out of respect or habit. "The air turns damp quickly here in the evenings." We walked back along the gravel path, our steps sounding oddly dull beneath the mist. I allowed the silence to stretch, giving him room to retreat from the conversation. But as we neared the gate, I ventured one more question. "Do the villagers speak of it still? This marriage?" Edward paused before replying, his hand resting briefly on the cold iron latch of the garden gate. "Rarely," he said at last. "It surfaces now and again, when the mist grows heavy like tonight, or when some child wanders too near the northern wall after dark. But for the most part it's treated like old weather, a thing one knows occurred but finds no use in discussing." We entered the vicarage, its lamp-lit windows glowing faintly against the gathering dusk. The warmth inside pressed pleasantly against my cheeks as my coat was removed. The fire crackled softly in the sitting room, and for a time we occupied ourselves with more trivial conversation. Letters received a minor debate on a point of heraldry, some reflections on a peculiar inscription Edward had uncovered in the parish chest. Yet beneath it all, my thoughts circled the marriage record and those two gravestones, paired impossibly in both life and death. Later that evening, as the hours drew long and the wind stirred faintly against the casements, I found myself at the window of my guest chamber, gazing out across the churchyard. The mist had thickened again into a low, rolling sea, and through its soft undulations the dark outline of the church tower rose like the prow of some ancient ship. I watched for some time, eyes growing heavy, and was about to turn away when a movement caught my attention. Near the northern wall, where the two gravestones rested, the mist parted briefly, lifted as though by some passing current, and revealed two faint, indistinct figures standing close beneath the yew. They were still, neither spoke nor gestured. Their forms were uncertain, but clearly distinct, one taller, one slighter, standing almost shoulder to shoulder. The mist closed again over them within a breath, as softly as a hand drawing shut a curtain. I remained at the window long after they had vanished, unsure whether what I had seen was real or the conjuring of tired eyes and suggestible thoughts. But I slept poorly that night, and I did not return to the window again. The following morning, Edward greeted me with his usual measured cordiality. He made no mention of my unsettled appearance, though I suspect he noticed the faint pallor beneath my eyes. We passed the early hours in quiet occupations, a review of his small but respectable collection of ecclesiastical seals, some discussion of regional maps, and a leisurely examination of a peculiar scrap of medieval brass he had recently acquired. Yet the weight of the previous evening's vision pressed steadily at the edges of my mind, refusing to fade into mere fancy. At length, as we took our midday tea near the garden window, I spoke. "Edward," I began, my voice quieter than I intended, "last night I thought I saw them." He did not feign ignorance. He simply waited, allowing me to continue at my own pace. "By the northern wall, two figures beneath the yew. They stood together for a moment, no more than that. Then the mist swallowed them again." Edward exhaled slowly, setting his cup down with care. "You are not the first to say so," he replied after a moment. "Nor, I suspect, shall you be the last." I studied his expression, looking for signs of amusement or skepticism, but found neither. "So it is common?" I asked. "Not common," he said, "but known. There are accounts, small ones, whispered. An occasional traveller, a village boy who dares the churchyard after dark, the odd grave-digger in his cups, always two figures, never alone." I let the quiet settle again before speaking. "Do you believe it, Edward?" He gave a thin, sad smile. "I believe the register records their names. I believe the stones mark their rest. And I believe that from time to time something stirs beneath the yew when the mist rises. Whether that is haunting, memory, or some fragment of time itself repeating its trespass, I cannot say." His words were delivered not as evasion, but as the most honest accounting of a man who had lived long enough with a puzzle to understand his own limits. That afternoon, the mist lifted for a brief time, and we ventured out once more into the churchyard. I found my gaze drawn again to those two stones, now appearing almost ordinary beneath the clear sky. But as we lingered there, another curiosity caught my eye, one I had somehow missed before. On the stone belonging to Eliza Dampier, faint but discernible beneath the dates, was a carved motif, a pair of small interlocking rings deeply incised into the weathered surface. Unusual. Marriage stones were not unknown, but seldom were such symbols placed upon the grave of a spinster, especially in a village of such modest means. I gestured to it. "This carving! Was it original?" Edward crouched to examine it more closely, his fingers tracing the weathered grooves. "It's difficult to say. The depth suggests it was cut after the initial inscription, perhaps by family, though no family of hers remains." I frowned slightly. "Or by someone else?" Edward rose, brushing the damp from his trousers. His gaze lingered on the stone for a moment longer than necessary. "Yes," he said softly, "or by someone else." The wind stirred again, and for the briefest instant I thought I heard, not quite carried on it, the faintest impression of voices, as though two people spoke softly just beyond the reach of my hearing. But when I turned my head, there was only Edward beside me and the quiet stones watching in their patient ranks. The remainder of the day unfolded without further disturbance, but the air within the house seemed subtly altered, as though some curtain had been drawn back and left ajar. I felt, not for the first time in my life, though rarely with such clarity, that peculiar tension between the ordinary and the unseen, where the world insists upon its familiar routines while something deeper pulses beneath its surface. As evening approached, Edward proposed we sit by the fire rather than retire to our separate reading. I sensed that he, too, was reluctant to leave the subject untouched now that it had been spoken aloud between us. "The thing that troubles me most," I ventured after a long silence, "is not so much their appearances, nor even the impossibility of the dates, but the implication that the ceremony was real." Edward nodded thoughtfully, stirring the logs with the brass poker. "Yes," he said, "the record holds the marriage as fact. The names, the place, even the witness marks are properly recorded. And yet," I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice, "if one of them had been long dead by the time of the other's birth, then who stood beside whom that day, and who conducted the service?" Edward let out a quiet breath, as though he had carried the same thought often but rarely spoken it. "There is an older fragment of the tale," he said, eyes fixed upon the slow curling of smoke into the flue. "Not often repeated, but it lingers among the oldest families. The suggestion that—" Here he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Certain ceremonies may be performed without full consent of the Church, that the forms of marriage can be mimicked where authority is absent, even where time is disjointed." I felt a faint chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "By whom?" I asked. Edward gave a small, helpless shrug. "By whom, or by what, I cannot say." We fell into silence again. The clock chimed 9, and the fire settled lower. It was then, as the room dimmed, that a sound reached us, soft, distant, but distinct. The slow, deliberate creak of the church's porch door carried faintly across the evening air. Edward's head turned slightly toward the window, but he made no move to rise. "It does that sometimes," he said quietly, "on nights like this." I stared into the fire a moment longer. "And no one is ever seen?" I asked. "No one proper." He offered no further explanation, and I did not press him. But I noticed that before we retired for the night, Edward locked the front door with a firmness that suggested a gesture of habit, not precaution. And again that night, as I lay awake longer than I cared to admit. I thought I heard faint footsteps upon the church path, two sets moving together, neither hurried nor hesitant. But when I dared rise and look, the mist had returned, and the windows showed only its soft, unbroken drift. The days that followed fell into a curious rhythm. We spoke little of the matter directly, but it hung between us like a painting draped in cloth, its presence undeniable even in concealment. Each morning brought the same grey dampness rolling in off the hills, and each afternoon we would take some small walk. Through the village lanes, along the hedgerows, or once even as far as the ruins of an old priory 3 miles distant. The land seemed to encourage such wandering, its quiet folds and low mists lending themselves to reflective conversation and long silences. And yet, even as we busied ourselves with such pastoral diversions, I became increasingly aware that my thoughts always circled back toward St. Hilary's, as though something there exerted a slow gravitational pull upon my mind. It was during one of these walks, as we returned from the far side of the village, that Edward finally spoke again of the red marriage. "There is one detail I've never resolved to my satisfaction," he said, as we approached the vicarage gate. His voice was low, as if inviting discretion even out here beneath the open sky. "What is that?" I asked. "The matter of the officiant." I stopped beside him. "You mean, who performed the ceremony recorded in the register?" He nodded. "Every marriage entered there bears the name of the vicar presiding, all except that one." I frowned. "There is no name recorded?" "None," Edward said softly. "Only the date and the witness marks. The column for the officiant is left conspicuously blank, as though—" He hesitated, as though no one wished to claim it. The chill I felt then was not merely of the wind. The thought of such an omission, deliberate, precise, struck me as far more unsettling than any careless error might have been. That evening, unable to content myself with speculation alone, I requested that Edward permit me to examine the register once more. He consented readily, as though half expecting my request, and we returned together to St. Hilary's as dusk began its slow descent. The interior of the church seemed darker than before, the failing light barely filtering through the narrow panes. The great oak door groaned softly as we entered, and our steps echoed hollowly along the worn flagstones. We lit no lamps, but instead worked by the last of the natural light. The register lay where we had left it, undisturbed beneath its wooden case. I lifted the cover gently, the aged leather cool beneath my fingers, and turned to the page in question. The entry was as I remembered it: Simon Elbright, bachelor of this parish, and Eliza Dampier, spinster of the same. Married the 14th of May, 1817. 2 witness marks, simple crosses, followed. But beneath the heading for officiant, the space remained blank, a silent omission more eloquent than any ink. I traced my finger lightly beneath the empty line, and for a moment felt absurdly as though some cold breath stirred faintly against my skin from beneath the page. Behind me, Edward stood silent. The church was very still, and then, quite softly, there came a sound that did not belong to us. From the far end of the nave, near the chancel steps, there issued the faintest whisper, a murmur so low that I could not make out words, only the cadence of quiet voices, speaking together. 2 voices, one lower, one lighter, rising and falling in gentle counterpoint as though rehearsing vows not yet or perhaps long since spoken. The whispering continued for several breaths, soft, regular, entirely self-contained. There was no urgency in it, no malice, but rather the uncanny intimacy of speech not meant for any third ear. Edward stood very still behind me, his breathing measured. Neither of us spoke, as though the slightest sound might rupture whatever fragile surface separated us from what moved beneath. Gradually, the voices faded, not with any abrupt cessation, but like the dwindling of wind through distant branches, until there was only the hush of the old stone once again. I closed the register gently, my fingers lingering for a moment on the worn leather as though to reassure myself of its ordinary substance. The church held its breath around us. At last Edward spoke, his voice no more than a whisper. They returned to the moment that never fully was. I turned toward him, my own voice similarly hushed. How long has this occurred? He exhaled, eyes fixed upon the dim chancel. Always, I think, or at least as long as anyone here remembers to speak of it. And none have tried to— I paused, uncertain even how to complete the thought. To intervene? To lay it to rest? Edward's mouth turned faintly downward. How does one lay to rest what never properly happened? They are not restless in the usual sense. They are not seeking release. They are simply continuing. We stood there in the gathering gloom, the failing light painting the stone with slow, uncertain strokes. Finally, Edward turned and led the way back toward the door. The hinges groaned softly as we passed into the encroaching dusk. As we stepped outside, the mist was rising again, coiling low along the earth like pale smoke. The gravestones nearest the church wall were half submerged in it, their tops emerging like old teeth from an ancient jaw. And there, beneath the northern yew, I glimpsed once more, just for an instant, the faint outline of two figures. They stood close together, facing one another, their outlines indistinct in the thickening vapor. The taller figure's head inclined slightly, as though speaking words I could not hear. The smaller shape stood still, receiving whatever was offered. Then the mist folded around them, and they were gone. Edward did not pause as he walked, but I noticed his pace had quickened ever so slightly. That night, as I lay awake in the guest chamber, the wind stirred softly against the leaded windows, carrying with it the faintest, most fragile impression, whether real or conjured I cannot say, of voices once more rehearsing their impossible vows, somewhere beyond the reach of time, yet still within earshot of Whit Barrow. The following day passed under a heavy ceiling of cloud. The mist, though thinner, never quite lifted, and the village seemed to shrink inward beneath its weight, as if reluctant to show too much of itself. Even the usual quiet bustle of the few shops and cottages seemed more subdued. Edward and I busied ourselves indoors with our books and trifles, but I could not shake the impression that the house itself was listening, sharing in the reserve that hung so palpably over the churchyard beyond. At luncheon, I found myself circling once more toward the lingering question. "Edward," I began, "have you ever come across any suggestion, any hint at all, as to why these two? Why Simon Elbright and Eliza Dampier, separated as they were by generations?" Edward looked thoughtful, folding his hands before him on the linen cloth. "Very little survives that might clarify it," he said. "Elbright appears briefly in a few of the parish accounts, land records mostly, but nothing remarkable. A modest yeoman family, likely long settled here before the Restoration. And the Dampiers? Even less. Tenant farmers, for the most part. The branch that produced Eliza seems to have arrived from Somerset some generations later. The families never overlapped. By all natural reckonings, they should never have met." I sipped my tea, letting the thought take its shape. Unless something, some force, contrived that they should. Edward did not immediately reply. Instead, he rose from his chair and crossed to a narrow cabinet near the window, unlocking it with a small brass key. From within, he withdrew a thin bundle of papers tied neatly with faded ribbon. "These," he said, returning to the table, "are fragments. Nothing official. Letters, scraps of notes, small items that came with the house. He untied the bundle with care and selected a single sheet of thick, yellowed paper. "Listen to this," he said softly, and began to read. "The girl has taken again to wandering the churchyard by dusk. I have spoken gently, but she insists she feels him near. I know not how she means it, but she speaks of his name, as though it belongs still in her present. The vicar advises patience, but I fear this cannot continue." Edward set the page gently upon the table between us. "The date?" I asked. 1816, the year before the marriage entry." We stared at the words in silence. The handwriting was delicate, a feminine hand, but unsigned. "She believed she knew him," I said at last, "though he belonged to another century." Edward gave a single quiet nod, or was made to believe it. The room darkened slightly as another drift of mist passed across the window, blurring the world outside into vague contours once more, and I could not help but wonder if two souls long separated by time were ever drawn together by some breach in the order of things, whether the act of union itself might not leave behind more than simply memory, whether it might leave an echo, one that, even now, had not fully ceased to speak. The hours after that conversation unfolded in an uneasy quiet, as though both of us were reluctant to tread further upon ground that had grown steadily more uncertain. There is a point, I find, when the accumulation of small impossibilities leaves one neither skeptical nor credulous, but suspended somewhere between, a liminal space, not unlike the mist itself, where definition becomes unsteady. As evening approached, Edward proposed a final walk before nightfall, more, I suspect, to soothe the tension than out of any desire for fresh air. The path we chose circled the far edge of the village, skirting the boundary of the old churchyard, but not entering it. The mist hung low across the fields, gathering in hollows and folds, while the silhouettes of distant trees wavered like figures unsure of their own positions. For a time we spoke of indifferent matters. The harvest, a recent publication from Cambridge on Roman tile stamps, the minor peculiarities of village governance. But inevitably the conversation drew back toward the shadow beneath which we had lived these past days. "There is one question I cannot help but return to," I said quietly, watching the last light pale along the horizon. Edward glanced toward me, waiting. "Why a marriage? Of all the forms such a rupture in time might take, why that particular joining? It suggests not accident, but design." Edward exhaled, his breath curling faintly in the chill. "There are some," he said carefully, "who would argue that certain rites, certain sacramental forms, carry with them a weight of their own, irrespective of sanction, that where proper boundaries are frayed, the form itself may operate as a kind of binding." "A binding?" He nodded once. "Two lives improperly aligned may yet find anchorage through such a rite, even when no officiant stands present, and once enacted, even outside the lawful calendar of years, it leaves its mark." I pondered this as we walked. The idea, absurd as it might sound in polite circles, carried with it a strange internal logic, that time, like earth, might shift under pressure, and that certain actions might fix those shifts into place, leaving a scar neither entirely visible nor entirely concealed. As the last light faded, we found ourselves drawing once more near to St. Hilary's, its square tower now rising like a darker block against the thinning sky. And then, for the first time in full clarity, I saw them, Beneath the northern yew, standing precisely where their stones lay, the figures stood together once more. But unlike before, when they had appeared as pale outlines, now they resolved themselves with greater substance. The man, tall, broad-shouldered, his garments unfamiliar to this century, held the hand of the woman who was younger, slighter, her dress of a later, more recent cut. They stood close, their heads inclined toward one another, their faces blurred but distinguishable as human features rather than mere shape. What struck me most was not their presence, but their stillness. They did not drift or shimmer like phantoms in a child's tale. They simply stood, as any two living persons might, locked in some private exchange beneath the yew's black boughs. Neither Edward nor I spoke. I felt him beside me, rigid, breathing slowly through parted lips. The figures remained only for a few heartbeats more. Then, with a slow and almost ceremonial grace, the man turned his head toward us, though whether in acknowledgment or indifference I cannot say. The woman remained facing him. And as the mist once again gathered itself, they were gone. Completely gone. We stood for several moments longer, neither willing to be the first to move. At last, Edward whispered as much to himself as to me, "They return to the moment that never was and can never fully be undone." And though we returned to the house that night and spoke no further of it, I believe we both knew, as certainly as we knew the solidity of the ground beneath our feet, that the red marriage of Whit Barrow endures still, quietly rehearsing itself in the folds of mist where time loses its grip. The remainder of my stay passed in an uneasy calm, though no further manifestations occurred, at least none that presented themselves to the waking eye. Yet the sense of something incomplete, some unresolved loop of time and intent, clung faintly to every hour I spent in Whit Barrow. Edward and I reverted outwardly to our old rhythms. We spoke of trifles, of books and weather and small antiquarian absurdities, as though by adhering to these familiar pursuits we might seal the experience safely behind us. But we both understood, I think, that it was not so easily dismissed. On the final morning of my visit, as the trap stood waiting in the lane to carry me to the station, Edward accompanied me as far as the churchyard gate. The sky was thinly overcast, and the stones stood quietly in their familiar ranks, untouched by any sign of the previous unease. We stood there for a moment, neither of us quite willing to part without addressing what lay between us. At last I said, "You intend to remain?" Edward smiled faintly, though his gaze drifted toward the church tower. "Yes, I've grown used to its company in a way." I followed his glance toward the northern yew, where the two old gravestones stood beneath its dark branches. They looked small now, ordinary, untroubled. "They are not dangerous to you, then?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't believe they mean harm. They are not like others." I knew what he meant, though neither of us cared to speak of it more plainly. "They simply remain," he continued softly, "bound together by some ritual neither sanctioned nor fully forbidden. Whether it was summoned by longing, by accident, or by something older, I cannot say. But here they are." We stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Edward extended his hand. "Come again, when you like," he said with quiet warmth. "The place is much the same. Mist, stones, and their peculiar inhabitants." I took his hand and held it firmly. "I shall." The trap creaked as I climbed aboard, and the driver flicked the reins. The lane bent gently away from the churchyard, and as we made our way toward the village edge, I allowed myself one final glance back. The yew stood motionless, its long branches drooping toward the earth. The gravestones beneath it were already fading into the veil of morning mist. and though I saw no figures there, I could not shake the quiet certainty that, in some thin fold of the air, where years blur and boundaries fray, they stood together still, endlessly joined in that impossible hour which neither truly possessed.